Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live broadcast, Advancements in WBC Differential Technology, presented by Don Wright, Scientific Affairs Manager, Hematology, Abbott Diagnostics. I'm Christina Jewell of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is brought to you by LabRoots and sponsored by Abbott Diagnostics. Now, before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you want at any time you want during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click the Send button. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. If you have any trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, click on the Support tab found at the top right of your presentation window, or report your problem by clicking on the Answer Question box located on the far left of your screen. This presentation is educational and thus offers continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located at the top right of the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Mr. Don Wright. Don Wright is a Global Scientific Affairs Manager for Abbott Diagnostics Hematology. Don has worked in clinical laboratory services and the commercial hematology industry for the entirety of his career. In his current role, Don provides scientific support for healthcare professionals and serves as a scientific resource to various functions, including R&D, business development, global strategic operations, and other departments. For a more detailed biography on Don Wright, please click on his biography tab at the top of this page. I would now like to turn the presentation over to Mr. Don Wright. Mr. Wright, you may begin your presentation.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Advancements in WBC Differential Technology. The speaker program is sponsored by and on behalf of Abbott Diagnostics. The content of this presentation is consistent with all applicable FDA requirements. Technological developments in automated hematology analyzers continue to transform the hematology laboratory. Each new generation collects more information about the properties of blood cells than the previous generation. Hematology analyzers are available from multiple manufacturers, and each uses a different combination of detection methods. Today, I will cover the following objectives. First, I will share with you a brief review of key milestones in the history of automation related to the WBC and differential counts. Next, an overview of methodologies used on automated WBC and differential cell counting analyzers, and how those methods are applied in contemporary hematology analyzers. I will also discuss the impact on the laboratory in performing the manual differential and the improvements made to minimize interfering substances, better identification of abnormal cells, and flagging. And lastly, I will discuss some key trends in automated differential analysis. So I'd like to share with you a brief history of key automated systems that have contributed to the development of automated WBC and differential analysis systems. Prior to the 50s, WBC counts were usually performed manually using the hemocytometer and the 100-cell microscopic differential count. It was performed using several variants of the Romanowski stains, like Wright, Giemsa, and May-Grenville. Key milestones was the award of a patent to Wallace Coulter for using an electronic method for counting particles. Shortly thereafter, he introduced the first viable electronic cell counter, the Coulter Model A. With the introduction of the transistors, this led to later models of cell counters, the Model FN and the Model S. The Model S was the first automated analyzer providing a 7-parameter CBC result. Replacing manual dilutions and counts reduced the turnaround time to 1 minute from what was usually taking a laboratory in 15 minutes. In the early 70s, Technicon Instruments introduced the Hemalog D 5-part differential analyzer based on cytochemistry staining of the WBC subpopulations while analyzing them with a continuous flow optical measurement system. Different technical approaches were taken by multiple manufacturers that produced 3, 5, and 6-part differential results along the way. As the need to reduce the number of manual differentials continued to drive the development of the automated differential, improvements were being made to develop computer-based automated digital morphology analyzers. These systems use primitive software to characterize WBC images from Wright stained smears and provide an estimate of each cell classification, providing images for the technologist to confirm by computer screen review. A geometric data Hematrack Model 590 was one such early system. In the 80s, a 6-part differential was fully incorporated in a benchtop CBC analyzer from Technicon, which also incorporated a laser for light scatter detection on that system. The Abbott Celldyne 4000 was introduced in 1996 with capability for automated enumeration of NRBCs, automated reticulocyte counts, and later introduced automated monoclonal antibody assays for CD61 immunoplatelet count as well as lymphocyte subset testing. For the past 20 years, there's been a continuous iterations of technological improvements and new methods providing an even more reliable means of reporting automated differentials. So, the goal of automated WBC differential method development is to design the detection technologies for the purpose of improving the accuracy in reportable automated WBC subpopulations, resulting ultimately in fewer manual differentials. Over the many generations of modern automated hematology analyzers, a variety of technologies and method combinations have been developed with each new generation of analyzer. In this slide, methodologies represent the technologies utilized in cell counting, and applications are how these technologies are put together in combination to produce the WBC and differential. I will now review several commonly used technologies used in automated WBC and differential analysis, beginning with impedance technology, RF conductivity, optical light scatter, cytochemistry, and the use of fluorescence detection. After a review of the methods, I will provide an overview of how these technologies are incorporated in the multi- or single-channel applications. The impedance method is based on the measurement of changes in DC electrical current, which are produced by a cell suspended in electrolyte solution as it passes through a very small aperture of known dimensions. Positive and negative electrode is submerged on either side of the aperture to create an electrical pathway. As each cell passes through the aperture, a change in the resistance between the electrodes is produced because blood cells are poor conductors of electricity. This change produces a measurable electrical pulse, which can then be used to estimate number and size of the particles that traverse the aperture. The challenge for this method in the early years was managing coincident events due to the closeness of cells as they pass through the aperture and recirculation of cells around the detection area of the aperture and being recounted. Impedance technology continued to evolve with changes to the reagent systems that were used, eventually delivering a 3-part WBC differential. In this slide, we're looking at a blood sample treated with a lysing reagent to lyse RBCs and permeabilize the white blood cell membrane, causing the membrane to collapse around the nuclear and cytoplasm components of the cell. The altered white cells can then be separated using impedance into 3 general groups based on the cell size, from smallest to largest: lymphocytes, mid-range cells, and granulocytes. Abnormal cells may appear as transitional populations that overlap the 3 normal populations, such as NRBCs, platelet clumps, giant platelets, or unlaced red cells, to name a few. When abnormal cells are detected, these need to be resolved with an alternate method, such as a microscopic slide review or 100-cell manual differential. Another key patent issued around 1970 was the discovery of a high-frequency signal using alternating current, which was defined as radio frequency, opacity, or conductivity. A high-frequency alternating current signal could demonstrate different properties of the WBC subpopulation. The measurement of WBCs as opacity resulted in response changes due to nuclear composition, cytoplasmic density, and other internal structures of the white blood cell. In this instance of electrical detection, the WBC cell wall acts as a conductor of AC current. The signal changes are not limited to event and size. The RF measurement is still used in some hematology systems to this day. Okay. So one of the difficulties associated with cell measurements, as we saw with the impedance transducer, is really controlling the WBCs and other cells from irregular recirculation in and around detection zones, in the case of the impedance, the aperture. This interference or duplication of signals by the same cell required correction, and it was found that they could correct. So for impedances could resolve when examining resulting pulses and applying pulse editing circuitry, try to evolve past the problems that the cells created when they were detected more than once. However, for optical detection, a new approach was needed to be developed. In a flow cytometer, the cell suspension is actually pumped from the specimen container through a sample tube into a special flow chamber called a flow cell, with a small opening at the tip. The suspension is then injected into a stream of fast-moving, cell-free liquid called the sheath fluid. This is actually called laminar flow and kind of works in the same context as what a laminar flow hood would work. The two liquids travel at different rates of speed, and they do not intermingle. That's what's called the laminar flow. Special geometry of the flow cell and flow rate of the sheath fluid cells, and it puts these cells actually in a single file line. So if you see the diagram or animation on the right, you can see the cells intersecting the laser path in a single file line. Cells are actually following the least point of resistance, and since there are two converging speeds, they look for that easier pathway. That's why they then line themselves up in single file. So this whole process that you see right here is called hydrodynamic focusing. And all systems that incorporate any type of optical subsystem for detection methods uses some form of hydrodynamic focusing. The hydrodynamic focusing is really not limited to optical light scatter measurements. It's often been incorporated into impedance technologies as well to further improve the accuracy of that measurement. So in this figure, as you can see, the cells and sample stream that they pass through creates that single linear flow of cells one at a time. This animation actually demonstrates the use of hydrodynamic focusing and the principles of optical light scatter detection. The focused flow stream of diluted white blood cells are injected into the flow cells we described by hydrodynamic focusing and enter the cell laser intercept area. You can see by the red beam that those cells intersect that. The cells scatter the light at different angles. Actually, they scatter light in 360 degrees, but yet we're only interested in certain angles of light scatter. And this yields information about the cell size, its internal structure, granularity, and even surface morphology. The optical signals the cells generate are detected and kind of converted to electrical impulse, which are then stored and analyzed by the computer system after the analysis. Once the final event is recorded, this data is then evaluated by an algorithm, and all angles of light scatter per event are classified by their common characteristics. If abnormal cells are present, flagging of those populations are indicated and further follow-up is required, obviously, again, going back to the manual differential. Since there are usually more than 2 different scatter detectors, each detection signal can be graphically represented in the form of dots on a scatter plot, as seen on the right-hand side. The dots are plotted at a point determined by the intersection of the channel information designated on the X and Y axis. For example, the cell falls in channel 50 on the X-axis and channel 50 on the Y-axis. It is plotted at the intersecting point of the 2 channels. So the scatter information may be plotted in various combinations to yield different information about the sample. And you may have multiple scatter plots that you could review looking for abnormal events. If the concentration of the cells are too high, or the stream speeds are not optimized, there can be a detection of doublets or a longer irregular signal that could represent 2 cells in close proximity, very similar to what we saw in impedance, passing at the same time. Therefore, it's important that both the dilution and injection speeds are optimized, and that's when, again, the designs of the new systems are set to do. Okay, I'd like to now transition over and discuss how contemporary hematology analyzers use various technologies and methods to determine the 5-part or greater diff automated differential. So let's consider 2 primary approaches. The first we will call kind of a multi-channel system. The multi-channel approach makes use of 2 or more discrete detection systems to quantitate the reportable WBC and differential. So we're actually making 2 separate dilutions and analyzing them in separate areas of the system. For example, neutrophils, eosinophils, monocytes, and lymphocytes may be determined and reported from one method or technology, and basophils and NRBCs reported from a second method or technology, and WBCs perhaps by a third method or technology. This approach uses the detection strength of one technology to kind of overcome the limitation of another technology. Ultimately, we're trying to improve the overall detection rate and apply the appropriate flagging to make sure we have an accurate result. The second approach we'll talk about is called single-channel system. The single-channel system makes use of a discrete detection system to quantitate the reportable WBC and differential. In the single-channel approach, only one dilution provides all reportable results, and the detection system may use multiple scatter angles of light scatter with additional WBC staining perhaps to improve the detection sensitivity and minimize potential of interfering substance. Okay, here's example 1 of a contemporary multi-channel analyzer detection system. I will not recognize any of the manufacturers in this approach, but I think most of you who have this type of technology will recognize it. In this instance, you see the upper left histogram indicates the WBC is determined by impedance measurement. The lower left scatter plot uses an interval angle 1 light scatter and volume to identify neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. The lower right scatter plot uses opacity or radio frequency and volume to complementary identify basophils. Even though they were seen in the scatter plot to the left, they're further verified with the scatter plot on the right. In additional combinations of light scatters, you can see on the upper right scatter plot impedance and RF, of optical light loss to identify NRBCs from WBCs, thus resolving the WBC in the 5-part diff NRBC. So in this instance, you actually see 6 discrete nucleated cells. Additional combinations of light scatter used, whether it be impedance, light scatter, RF, provides additional information for detection of interfering substances and, of course, flagging of potentially abnormal cell types. Okay, this is example number 2 also from a contemporary multi-channel analyzer. This system uses a cytochemical staining method for the enzyme peroxidase found in the granules of some white blood cells. The top plate you see up there at the very top shows two peroxidase negative cells at the upper left and upper right of that image, along with two different peroxidase positive staining cells at different levels of peroxidase concentrations on the bottom left and bottom right. The lower left scatter plot displays the WBC cell's peroxidase staining activity on the x-axis and the relative cell size on the y-axis, and identifies neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and a classification that's really not classified, which is a large peroxidase negative cell, along with a secondary total white count from this channel as well. So this dilution does bring a lot of information. The lower right scatter plot indicates interval angle 1, light scatter on the x-axis, and cell size on the y-axis to identify basophils along with the primary WBC count, and additional information for interference detection and flagging. Cytochemistry is used in this instance as well. In the case, we're actually not staining the cells, but we're doing selective lysine. That may be deemed as another terminology for cytochemical effect. The basophils are located above, if you notice, the other light scatter events, because they are intact with cell membrane. And the lower clusters are representative of the WBC nuclei only and are evaluated based on their respective cell chromatin density. And there's example number 3, a contemporary multi-channel analyzer detection system. This system uses a fluorochrome dye staining method for fluorescent labeling of WBC nucleic acids, proteins, and the cytoplasmic organelles in 2 angles of light scatter. The left scatter plot, if you notice, indicates fluorescence activity on the y-axis and light scatter angle 1 on the x-axis to identify combined neutrophil basophil population together, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, immature granulocytes, along with information on NRBCs and abnormal cells. The right scatter plot indicates light scatter angle 2 on the y-axis and the cell fluorescence on the x-axis to further identify basophils and NRBCs and the WBC count, along with additional information for interferences, detection, and flagging. Okay, so now let's review a single channel system. Remember, the single channel approach makes use of one discrete detection system to quantitate the reportable WBC and differential. One dilution is used to provide all reportable results on the WBC count, which would include neutrophils, immature granulocytes, eosinophils, basophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, NRBCs, and additional information for the detection of interferences and flagging of abnormal cells when present. As we touched upon fluorescence detection on the multi-channel example, this example of a single-channel fluorescent flow cytometric technology simultaneously measures and analyzes multiple physical characteristics of single cells as they flow in a fluid stream through a beam of light, in this case a laser. The cellular event properties measured include multiple angles of light scatter, as I said, not just 2, but multiple, which helps determine the cell size, granularity, internal complexity, lobularity, fluorescence intensity from the staining of nucleic acids in nucleated cells. These characteristics are determined using an optical to electronic conversion system that records how the cell scattered incident light and emits fluorescence. Take a look at the upper left image. At low resolution, these are what the stained nucleated cells look like. The upper right image is a high resolution image of the categorized fluorescent positive nucleic cells cellular events. And you can see clearly something that looks very similar to when we look at a microscopic evaluation of a Wright stained smear. In this case, obviously, we're seeing one color of fluorescence. The lower left image and lower right image are scatter plot results combining light scatter and fluorescence detection, identifying the cells listed in the bottom image in the center. So from this one single dilution, we can manifest a complete 6-part diff, actually 7 if you're including the NRBC. Okay, this animation demonstrates the processing of nucleated cells using a single channel, multi-angle laser light scatter and collection of fluorescence emitted from the stained cells. During this process, the diluted cells are rapidly injected through the analyzer's optical flow cells we previously talked about. In addition, depolarized light and red fluorescence data is accumulated on up to 20,000 events as they pass through. The optical and fluorescence data of the unclassified cells, as you see accumulating on the right-hand side of the graphic, form the records, the 5 pieces of optical and fluorescence data that we will use to classify those cells. These broadly equate to cellular size, complexity, lobularity, granularity, and DNA staining. Once the data is collected to 20,000 events, the software algorithms take over and begin classifying these cellular events. Nucleated red blood cells are the first classified using this approach. And you can see, looking at their fluorescent characteristics, how they stand out, and all the events that are in the DNA column that has that particular value plus size are classified as NRBC. The remaining leukocytes are then separated into mononuclear, polymorphonuclear events and are separated using 90 degrees versus 90 degree depolarized to identify neutrophils from eosinophils. The remaining lymphocytes, monocytes, and basophils are separated and identified using their size and complexity characteristics. The data and numbers that you see in the center are the signatures, the optical signatures and fluorescent signatures of each of the events, which are later classified as the cells indicated on the grid. Once the data is analyzed and completed, the cellular events are then color-coded to make it easy for the operator to visualize the cells. And in this three-dimensional representation of the data, it highlights that this is truly a multi-angle, multi-dimensional analysis, completing the 5-part differential. So, as we've just described a lot of the methodologies and the applications of those methods, we've come quite a long way in the advancement of being able to resolve not only accurate white blood cell counts, but also the 5-part or 6-part plus differential. We have actually seen review rates of manual differentials drop dramatically over this period of time. However, we have to ask ourselves at times when we go to the laboratory, is this enough information? Are they satisfied with this? And I think if you ask yourself that question, the answer is always no, it's not. And the reason for that is, to this date, labor shortages continue to challenge the laboratory, especially as testing continues to increase, as, believe it or not, where populations are growing older. And the cliche, the laboratory still must do more with less, continues to be discussed always in the C-suite. However, laboratories continue to report the manual reviews, and differentials are still one of the most important criteria when choosing a new hematology analyzer. And they see the time-consuming and labor-intensive manual diff the primary impediment in further streamlining their much-needed labor savings. The need for manual reviews and differentials is based on many reasons. This is a study that was performed and published by the CAP in 2006 called the Q-Probe study, and it looked at a number of laboratories. You can see, I think the number is 263 institutions and over 95,000 differentials. And they looked to see what actually is the reason why we're doing the manual diff. The need for the manual reviews and differentials is based on many reasons, including lack of results, flagged results, and of course, interferences. So the reasons for reflex manual smear reviews, types reviews performed, and assessment of whether new information was learned from the reviews was reported in the study as well. And to no surprise, the WBC flag and or presence of an immature cell flag accounted for over 62% of the samples requiring further review. As this study is nearly 12 years old, the number of reviews may have improved a little bit with the advent of new technology. But trust me, it's still a very large and considerable number of reviews that remain to this day due to these same reasons. It's interesting also to note that the manual differential represented 60 to 40% edge over the manual scan. So it appears that people have a tendency, because the improvement of technology has maybe reduced the instance of scanning, but because it cannot resolve the abnormal pathologies, increase the number of manual diffs compared to just trying to do a scan. So, laboratories, physicians, and patients face consequences if flagged results are reported without smear reviews. We know that. Interference associated with WBC and differential analysis has not been eliminated in spite of all the advancements that we've made in the detection technologies used by newer generations of heme systems. The need to visually review a flag remains to be a very important step in the verification and validation of reportable results. This is a list of WBC interferences that remain numerous, and laboratories' SOPs are designed to capture these when the analyzer flags or indicates there's a problem with the sample. This was a study that was done, or actually a publication that was done back in 2007. But we're still struggling with some of the technologies on the market to overcome some of these interferences. Some of these interferences will never be resolved because they are either pre-analytical problems that may have occurred in collection of the blood sample, or could be a condition that would create problems such as high lipids or even with clump platelets. So really, instrument methods, research, and development that we continuously are trying to make strides in minimizing the impact of these interferences. And surprisingly, some of these have been resolved, but many of them are still unresolvable. Flagging the efficiency of the automated hematology white count and differential technology becomes an important contribution in increasing the productivity by accurately decreasing the review rates. So in other words, when developing new technologies, many cellular characteristics must be factored in to try to understand and identify, especially the immature cell types. As you can see, the WBC blast flagging on the left-hand side, the variation in blasts is great, high degree of shapes and sizes, and so therefore with that there needs to be a variety of strategies necessary to use our detection systems to help find these types of immature cells. So the laboratory must also set their own flagging response criteria as well. The International Council for Standardization of Hematology has published initial guidelines which each laboratory should review and adjust their protocols to their respective patient populations with respect to flagging conditions. Reduction in false positives and minimizing the number of false negatives have continued to improve with every iteration of next generation system. However, there's still a great deal of room for improvement. With the improvements in laboratory information systems, though, many rules may be applied to coincide with the automated system's overall flagging efficiency. So we are making progress. Unfortunately, we're not eliminating these altogether. So let's explore some of the future trends of automated differential analysis. We've talked about and discussed several of the current methodologies and associated applications listed here. But let's take a closer look at potential developments that may impact the next generation of hematology systems. can we say, will it be a new or improved fluorochrome development, possible improvements in reagent systems? Could be a new detection system using advanced optics or other technologies yet to migrate to a hematology analyzer platform. It could be all of those. Could it be additional light scatter intervals or harnessing the advancements of artificial intelligence with the use of learning algorithms that catalog abnormal cell types and remembers their respective technological signatures that can later teach the analyzer how to find the abnormal cell? All of these are possible. This is also one development that could have a huge impact in the further research of automated systems, and one that is often not thought about, but has been brought to our attention by, again, the ICSH, the International Committee on Standards in Hematology, International Council of Standards in Hematology, and that is design a new method for and replacing the current reference method for WBC differential. That is totally dependent on expert microscopists and the statistical limiting 400 cell manual differential. The ICSH has indicated the need for a new reference method for the leukocyte differential count, and the proposed approach is to investigate flow cytometric candidate methods using multiple monoclonal antibodies. I can recall many years ago, maybe even 30 years ago, it was believed that this would actually be the WBC differential of the future. Unfortunately, the cost was prohibitive. And the aspect of the cost of monoclonal antibody testing was realized, and the use of those technologies was limited to special testing for advanced disease detection and identification, and still is today. However, if we had a reference set of monoclonal antibody methods that could be developed, this would provide manufacturers and researchers the reproducible, confirmed, ground truth cell classification for improving their respective technologies and subsequent algorithm development. One of the most frustrating applications today is when we try to compare even manual diffs, 200 cell manual diffs, from one observer to a second observer or even to an arbitrator. And oftentimes when pathology is present, they don't match up. So that inhibits our opportunities to actually use our learning algorithms to effectively identify those cell types. So this would be and have a big impact. Also, perhaps as I mentioned previously, we could add additional light scatter and improve the WBC differential. If a new reference method using monoclonal antibodies for truth was in use, the exploration and refined characterization of cells and light scatter could be improved using such approaches as supervised learning technologies. Not exactly a neural network resolving random information, but actual human expert supervised learning technology. This would allow a reference ground truth database to be established and then to train the learning algorithm via a network of information and big data to understand exactly that this is going to resolve this type of specific abnormal cell type. Without that ground truth database, it becomes very difficult to push beyond where we are right now with some of the advances of optical light scatter and or other methods. And of course, I think we're all getting used to the fact that digital morphology has become part of our automated experience with the WBC differential. Advancements in digital morphology from a cell locator to a diagnostic portable someday could be a reality. As you know, right now, many of us use some sort of digital morphology to help resolve and do the differential and save time. So it becomes more of a cell locator, and the technologist will be called over to actually look at and review the cells that the digital morphology system has identified. But if you think about it, right now, as per Moore's law, which really isn't a law, which states basically the CPU processing power doubles about every 2 to 2.5 years. High-resolution digital morphology currently contains lots of big data, and it needs improved processing power. So it could be possible that improvements in processing speed using artificial intelligence and advanced machine learning algorithms could someday provide the human-to-machine compatible WBC image in such numbers that the cell locator could actually report the results with little or no laboratory review. So is that possible? My belief right now is this has to be one of the leading trends in the advancement of more reportable automated differentials. So in summary, the advancements in WBC and automated differential testing has evolved over the past 60 years to the point that normal WBC and diffs are largely reported without human intervention to this day. The average review rates could range from 50% in your large oncology hospital settings to maybe as few as less than 10% in some of the hospitals that have more of a normal patient population. There remains a significant number of manual differentials, however, that need laboratory review. So advancements in methodologies and increasing processor speeds may further improve our automation to the point where only a handful of manual reviews would be necessary in the busiest of laboratories. All right, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, and we're going to answer some questions as they come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Don, for that informative presentation. We will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Answer a Question box located on the far left of your screen, and we'll answer as many questions as we have time for. Okay, Don, our first question is, now we heard about single and multi-channel approaches to delivering the WBC differential. Is there a particular advantage you would think one approach has over the other?
Thanks, Christy, for the question. With regards to multi-channel approaches, they're very well thought out systems. It's kind of interesting to note over the development of technologies, when systems kind of come together from a manufacturer standpoint, it's often limiting because there has been some progress made with patents, et cetera, that that particular manufacturer may not be able to use. So what has occurred is you had this approach where creatively they've developed methods and technologies to work around patents in some cases. And when you look at a multi-channel approach, you are using multiple dilutions as well. And generally speaking, your reagent usage or reagents needed to accommodate those technologies is also multiple types of reagent systems. So with respect to that, you have 2 dilutions, possibly, maybe more, multiple reagents to support those dilutions and those methods. In the end result, I'm sure it's a good result, but there can be, again, if one particular method is problematic, you have a higher incident, perhaps, maybe of a problem where it has to be repeated or then manual completed. Single channel systems probably will save the laboratory from a reagent standpoint. They're usually minimal reagents. It's a single dilution. It also accommodates a higher throughput at times because you're just going through in a single pass approach. And typically, the simpler reagent system will make the system overall a little less complex. So there may be some advantages with the single channel approach over the multi. But again, I think the end result with regards to your reportable differentials will be fairly similar.
Thank you, John. Our next question comes in from Vicki. She would like to know, is there an EDTA effect on the accurate determination of individual WBC identification? For example, should you wait a specific period of time prior to running a specimen?
That's a good question, and it's very dependent on your technology and system that you're using. As generations of system have come along, there's less need to wait Again, I would refer to the manufacturer's operator's manual, but they're early on, as some of the impedance methods, especially the three-part differential technology methods, evolved, there appeared that there was some impact on the stabilization period that EDTA has on the white blood cells within that first 15 to 20 minutes. And most of the time, though, from the point of where the sample was drawn, by the time it gets to the laboratory, that period would elapse, and there was no real issues with performing that sample. But for the most part, the modern systems, contemporary systems are out there. You see little, if not no, effect of EDTA on the white count or the subpopulations that it's trying to identify.
Now, Don, would it be possible to include a live dead stain in the future?
Yes, there's actually a system that's on the market at this point that does use the staining process that actually does determine and kind of a viability of the white blood cells. Propionimide is the actual stain that it uses, and that's been pretty well established as a good stain for viability detection. Other methods, as they evolve, also provide similar cell wall permeabilization rates and identification of live or dead cells, and may report them in a viability fraction to the operator that could then use that information to determine if the sample's age sample or not, or if there's other problems impacting the results of that sample.
Now, Don, why is the throughput of a hematology analyzer not getting to higher levels while volume of testing continues to rise? They seem to be stuck at about, around 100 CBCs per hour.
That's a good question. I think there are some limitations when using the kind of when you're doing a dilution, you do have to have some interaction time with your particular reagent system, with your method or application. And then you actually have to have counting time. So once that sample has been diluted, it has to wait for a few seconds and then inject it into your detection system. So the complexities of delivering all the information that the system's delivered today, is somewhat predicated based on, incubation times perhaps, or just the number of samples going through. And it's generally speaking, about every 30 seconds, you have to hold a sample before you can actually analyze it.
John, is there a system that is better for age samples?
Every manufacturer has guidelines, I think, in their operator's manual, which discusses their ability to work with age samples. And it's important to look at those studies. Those are published studies, and again, I think you can draw your conclusions on how one method or another would work with regards to running all age samples. There's no doubt as EDTA samples age, the white blood cells do change. Their cell membranes begin to deprotonize, and there are both internal as well as external differences from fresh sample to an age sample. With that in mind, your counts are going to be okay. I think where you will see any impact may be somewhat on flagging. And with respect to one system or other having flagging, some systems do actually take into consideration some of the flagging that could be associated with non-viable events, and that's if they're detecting viability, where some systems don't have that capability. So just ask the manufacturers if they've accounted for that.
Thank you, Don. Now, the bulk of technology innovations, they seem to have, been in the 1970s, 1980s. Why has there been a slowdown in the recent years?
Well, I don't know if there's actually been a slowdown per se. Have we seen, huge changes like we did, as the pursuit to report the 5-part or 6-part differential. In that period of time, it was I would say maybe the automated period of discovery where, people say, hey, I have a method, I have an application that I can determine, the subpopulations, and the challenge went out. But once you get into the rare event situation of abnormal pathology, pathological cells, it becomes quite difficult to really try to maintain throughput and maintain methods without trying to find something else unique that would actually identify those particular abnormals. So, I think we're just entering a new age of advanced processing speed. I think maybe a new age of alternate approaches to resolving abnormals and interferences. So yes, we've seen those improvements over the past 20 years, as I mentioned in the presentation. I think we're on the verge of seeing some greater advancements based on harnessing just the artificial intelligence and processing powers that are now brought to our systems and able to look at new algorithms and approaches to that. So I think we're ready for a new stage of development.
Excellent. Thank you, Don. We have time for a few more questions. Now, looking at the limitations in providing differential results, is there still a place for the impedance technology in today's laboratory?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, depending on your complexity of your laboratory, the types of patients that you are processing, certainly impedance does provide, a robust counting approach with not only counting the cells, but even in their approach of doing the 3-part differential. I don't find those becoming obsolete in any anytime soon, unless there's another quicker approach or dry approach to doing the count as opposed to perhaps doing the dilution approach.
Do you see hematology testing moving to POC approach like many others?
I think it's already there. If you take a look at some of the point-of-care testing systems, you'll have some sort of hematology values there. Again, it's going to be limited information, and for quick screening, I think for immediate understanding of general health, and that's what obviously the CBC provides, in particular the anchor parameters such as hemoglobin to assure that we are dealing with something that we can test for anemia. White counts and those populations are a little bit more challenging. Again, some have very small analyzers that can perform those. And again, for quick screening, I think there's still going to be a need for that in the point-of-care testing for sure.
Thank you, Don, and thank you for your important research. Do you have any final comments for our audience?
Well, again, I appreciate everyone attending today's webinar. And certainly I think as we look forward in the area of automated hematology, there's a lot ahead of us, and I think a lot to discover yet. Someday I think they will happen very, very quickly as far as reportable CBCs. And I think we will eventually get to the point where we will look back and say, why did it take so long to get to this point, as we have previously when you look at the history of hematology. So again, appreciate it, and thank you very much.
Thank you again, Don. Now, before we go, I would like to thank our audience for joining us today and for their interesting questions. Questions we did not have time for today will be addressed by the speaker via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. We would like to thank LabRoots and our sponsor, Abbott Diagnostics, for underwriting today's educational webcast. This webcast can be viewed on demand through September 2018. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, goodbye.